Perfect. Nice.
Okay, now you should get the actual warning saying that we're recording. Thank you for catching that there, Josh.
No problem.
Perfect. So here's our agenda for the day. So the main thing I really want you to take away today is what not to do as a US expat. In other words, the main thing I'm trying to make sure of is that you don't show up into our office a couple years from now saying, I bought these investments or those investments, and now I have to unravel it. We'll talk about how you really get started with your plan, what you should be doing, i.e. for your banking and your investment relationships. And then, we'll cover a little bit on ESG, but not so much, because I want to leave all that time for Q&A. So we'll kind of jump right in, and I will let Cam and Isa do the talking with a nice little video to start off.
John Burrow once said, "A man can fail many times, but he isn't a failure until he begins to blame somebody else." Despite these wise words, we are in the age of Trump and Brexit. Therefore, let's start to point fingers.
Most all American expats have had many negative ramifications from the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, also known as FATCA. In fact, it might have led to the closing of your brokerage account in the United States, or even your non-US bank telling you to go elsewhere.
So it's Obama's fault, right?
Not exactly. When you follow along with FATCA brought about, it's really introduced ways that American expats could get caught while not declaring taxes, owning PFICs, or even not declaring taxes that were owed.
So if Obama just built a means to catch non-compliant individuals, why did everything change for expats in 2010?
Well, rules from past presidents started to be enforced. Ronald Reagan, the beloved president that was in favor of cutting taxes, added a huge tax to American expats with foreign investments with the introduction of PFIC rules, also known as passive foreign investment companies. These were designed to prevent Americans from owning managed vehicles from foreign jurisdictions.
So what about the notorious Nixon?
In 1970, Richard Nixon signed into place the Bank Secrecy Act, and American expats had to report all foreign bank accounts that aggregate to over $10,000 US. They have subsequently never increased this amount to meet inflation growth. If you haven't provided these documents, they can lead towards large fines. All the while, no tax is ever owed on these declarations to the Treasury Department. Until FATCA, Nixon and all subsequent presidents had no means to police the foreign banks and to enforce the rules.
For the sake of pinning the blame for the frustrations behind being an American expat, we blame Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln may have abolished slavery in the United States, but made any American that moved out of the country de facto slaves, of which no other country other than Eritrea follows the logic, and even Canada has banned them from being able to do so. Abraham Lincoln introduced citizens-based taxation with the first income tax signed on August 5th, 1861, and was a measly 3% of income to help fund the North in the Civil War efforts. All of the above culminated in what is now known as the FATCA Accords established by Barack Obama. This law was designed to increase the compliance of U.S. taxpayers that had reporting requirements for financial accounts that were held in foreign jurisdictions. To ensure compliance throughout the chain, the new framework imposed legislation onto both the individual and the financial institutions that service the U.S. persons. This led to the stricter reporting standards and larger penalties being imposed for non-compliance. With the newfound power in place, the FATCA Accords essentially became the international policing force for U.S. persons with foreign accounts and assets. With over 113 countries having signed up to comply with the U.S. FATCA rules, and an additional 200,000 plus institutions having registered with the IRS.
Perfect. So now we've covered the big semblance of why people think it's complicated to be moving around or to be living abroad as an American citizen. We've got a slew of different acronyms: FATCA, FBAR, PFIX, and the likes. And that's where we know that these are going to affect you, and you need to make sure that you have a good understanding of them to not make those types of mistakes. So essentially, FATCA isn't the thing that's really the problem. It's these past rules that FATCA makes it easy for them to implement those types of strategies or those types of rules. In other words, they can make sure that they catch you if you have accounts with over $10,000, which go back to the FBAR rules, and they can find out if you have PFIX in foreign jurisdictions, which is why the foreign institutions are not allowing you to open up accounts. It's not because they don't want to, it's because it's probably irresponsible for them to do so. Now, essentially, that means that we would recommend for you, when you're moving abroad, to have your investments accounts back in the States or with an institution that can hold US securities. If you're buying individual stocks, this is not so significant. If you're buying individual bonds, same thing. It doesn't have to conform with those US rules. You'll just have a little bit more legwork on your US taxes. So you can buy an individual stock in, say, InBev, the biggest company in Belgium, and it won't be breaking any of those PFIC rules. But if you have a mixed diversified portfolio, you probably want to buy those exchange traded funds back in the United States. Now, to me, there's 5 reasons why you want to do so. The first one is because it avoids those PFICs. If you never have to learn what a PFIC is, you'll be a happy person. You can look back in our YouTube library. We have an entire playlist just for Belgium. And Shannon Mayer, who is a corporate member of the American Club of Brussels and a tax accountant for US Expats, talks extensively about what PFICs are and why he doesn't want you to own them. But the importance is, if you buy any investment structure that's built outside of the United States, it will be considered a PFIC. And not only will you have higher accounting costs every single year, you'll most likely have higher tax costs in the United States. So it might be more convenient from the vantage point of just going down to an institution and keeping it in euros, but it will probably cost you more in the long run. The second reason, you get the documentation. The 1099 makes it really easy to do your US taxes. Now, our firm, what we do is we convert all of the income in Belgium into euros so that you'll be able to do your Belgian taxes very easily. So we'll kind of stop on there for 1 second. Belgium is a really nice jurisdiction to live in. I know we have somebody saying that they were thinking about moving to Belgium. Belgium has no capital gains tax, so they're only actually taxing you on the income. So that's really nice news for you, because we're only having to pay that income tax, and then you're able to use that as a credit to offset any income tax on passive income that you might have in the United States. But that doesn't mean you get to avoid the capital gains tax in the United States when you're in Belgium, just because it's capital gains tax free in Belgium. So it is a little bit of a disadvantage, but it would be very much similar to living back in the United States. The 1099 makes it easy to report that in the United States, and then we convert all the income for Belgium into euros so that you can either do your own taxes in Belgium, or that you can pass that on to your tax accountant and they're not having to figure out the currency conversion for each transaction. The third one is compliance. Keeping your investments in the United States means that you don't have to worry about that FBAR. That FBAR, remember, is the accumulation of all your accounts around the world. Essentially, if all of them combined, including company accounts or charity accounts that you're a signer for, at any time they go over 10,000 US dollars, you have to do an FBAR declaring all of those accounts. If your investment accounts are in the United States, you don't have to think about doing an FBAR for them, because, well, the Treasury already has the ability to monitor them. So makes it a little bit easier by slimming down the amount of administrative work that you need to do. Fourth reason, safety. You probably have all heard of FDIC or SIPC, which has guarantees of not only your funds inside of a brokerage account and a bank account, but it also has a way to wind down institutions if there's problems. So in 2008, when Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns failed, essentially they had a means for the SIPC to take them over, and for Lehman Brothers to move them over to Barclays Wealth Management, for Bear Stearns over to JP Morgan. A little bit annoying because you didn't know who to call, but at the end of the day, your money was safe at a big institution. Not every country has those same safeguards. While Belgium is pretty secure, we still remember Belfius getting taken over by the government, and therefore it was in the politicians' hands of how that process would be. But we've had other, say, island jurisdictions in Europe that essentially took 10% off the top of all accounts because they were having some hardships. We don't have those abilities in the States, so we know what that safety mechanism is dating back to just after the Great Depression. So I find that to be a great utility versus using some of these offshore jurisdictions that aren't as secure from those vantage points. The last thing to me is the most important thing. We have international platforms for our clients, but most of our clients keep their money back in the States purely just based on fees. Everything in Europe costs a little bit more, including banking and investing. While most of the big institutions in the United States are not charging trading fees anymore, essentially every institution in Europe, for the most part, is charging trading fees. So it can be cheaper for you to invest back in the States, just a little cumbersome that you need to move your euros into dollars and think about it in those regards. Which means we really have to think about our currency exposure. Now, there's 5 big ways that you can be looking at reducing some of your currency risk. And let's say all of your money is back in the United States and you're in Belgium and you're planning on buying a home or planning on starting a business in Belgium in the next couple of years. You might want to think about the first 4 future contracts, forward contracts, options, and swaps. These are great mechanisms to manage your currency risk in the nearer term so that we don't have to worry about volatility. Now, this might seem something foreign to you because for the last 14 years, we've seen the dollar just go straight up. But historically, if we go back before even the euro started 22 years ago, and we used the ECU, the European currency unit, as a mechanism, we've typically had 10 to 15 years worth of dollar strength and then 10 to 15 years of dollar weakness. We know that those are the typical time periods. And what we would kind of expect is, because we've had such a strong dollar the last 14 years, I'm not naming the day or the month or the year, but when it goes down, we'll probably have a good period of time where we'll have euro strength and dollar weakness. Now, hopefully that won't be because of stagflation or a recession or such, but that might be imminent in these near terms. So just because the last 14 years the dollar has been going up doesn't mean that that's going to be constant. So you might want to go ahead and hedge some of that currency risk just in case the euro goes up before you need to make that big purchase. So that's where those first 4 options work. The last option is really natural hedging. And we're going to talk in depth about natural hedging and how to set up our portfolios when it comes to investments, no matter which side of the pond you're going to end up on. But before that, let's dig just a little bit deeper into how to value a currency, because in our minds, it's not really important what happened the last 14 years because we can't benefit from that. What we have to look at is where is the value, and therefore where is the opportunity. If something is cheap, it can't go down as much as something that's expensive. And economists normally use what's called the Purchasing Power Index, the PPI. It's more fun to use the Big Mac Index, which has been around since the 1970s. It's a tongue-in-cheek play on PPI, where the economists basically took what the value of a Big Mac was all around the world, and they valued it based on what the US dollar was doing. And what you'll notice is that most all the world right now is devalued compared to the dollar, except for Sweden, Norway, and Switzerland. It hasn't been like that for all that long. We had a few more countries in there in the beginning, right after the financial crisis. So we had Canada, we had Australia, and we had the UK in there. But in 2014, we had a commodity shock, and Australia and Canada's currencies are really, really dependent on having strong commodity prices. So they're starting to rebound right now, but in 2014, they fell apart, and therefore they were no longer part of that strong bucket. And then we all know Brexit pulled the UK out of Europe and destabilized their currency. A couple articles this morning just going on about how they expect the pound to be acting more like an emerging market currency in the next couple of years than one of the old, dependent, reliable, safe currencies. Scary thought in certain regards for people that are sitting on a lot of pounds, and scary thoughts for the companies that are based predominantly in the UK and the likes, because, well, it destabilizes what things can go on. But that's what left us with these 4 strong currencies. The pandemic really enforced people to go into strong currencies, and then typically as things normalize, it distributes. That's why I'm saying we know the pandemic's not over. We know there's multiple issues going on right now, which we talked about in our last economic brief. But essentially, what we'd expect is as things normalize, that will spread back out to multiple strong currencies, whereas right now it's really harboring right there in the US dollar. So how does that affect our portfolios? Well, this is where we consider it natural hedging. And this is where it's really important for you to not just think, I've got a pension in Belgium and that's more euro based, and I've got a pension in the United States and that's more US dollar based, and hopefully I've got the right allocation. What we want to think about is we want to think about the end in mind. Where will we end up at the end of our career, and where will we need the funds? If we're moving to Belgium for a couple of years and we're going to move right back to the States and retire back in the States, we probably want to use our US dollar portfolios. Now, and it doesn't matter what institution you go to in the United States, essentially most every firm in the United States is going to have more of a USD allocation. Whereas most every institution in Belgium is going to have more of a euro type of allocation. So a heavier natural hedge to euros. So if we're saving while we're in Belgium and we're going to go back to the States, we want to keep using those types of portfolios that are heavier on US dollars to minimize that currency risk over the course of time. But if we're changing our mind and we're going to retire in Belgium or France or someplace else, we probably want to take those portfolios that you've been saving up and start to minimize that currency risk, minimize the potential of a 10 to 15 year shift by buying more European companies. This is not a profit maximization strategy. What it is a risk mitigation strategy. So it's just reducing one of those risks, because half the time it's going to be better and half the time it's going to be worse. But when you're buying your bread in the same currency that you're investing in, you're reducing that risk. And that's why we're proponents of using this type of a strategy, because we've seen big moves in currencies over those periods of time, 30, 40%. And if you're down 40% when you need to retire and need to get that income, that's going to affect what you can retire on significantly, or whether you can retire when you want to. Hence the real need to be thinking about natural currency hedging and making sure that we can minimize some of those different risks. Now, I'm going to give you a few resources that I think will really help in your whole process. In the follow-up email, we'll send you a copy of our US Expat Guide. It's going to go into depth in writing on what PFICs are, what FBAR is, etc. how to think about totalization agreements when it comes to Social Security, and all of those types of tools to drum up any questions that you might have. Feel free to reach out to myself or anybody on the team to ask any questions inside of the US Expat Guide, but it's a really nice first place to start on what things to avoid. The second place is American citizens abroad. If you don't know American citizens abroad, you definitely should. They're a wonderful resource to find a slew of activity, and they have two different sides of what they do: lobbying and advocacy. Essentially, the first part is hosting these types of webinars where they're information based. We host a lot of them with them to try to make sure that people are informed and they know how to do things when they're abroad. The other side of things is actually lobbying the US government. So yes, they have their own lobbyist in Washington, D.C. that represents us. And one of their big initiatives right now is residency-based taxation, to get rid of that pain that Abraham Lincoln put in place that makes it very hard for a lot of individuals to do their finances in an easy way. So if you're wondering how you can help, that's the organization that you want to support. That's who you want to give your feedback to, and you can get a lot of information from them. I sit on their advisory committee just for full disclosure, and so that's where you'll find my picture right there on their website. But Mary Louise is a wonderful resource, and you should definitely check out their website and support that group. A few other resources. I talked about PFICs and not wanting to deal with them. Like I said, we have a video on our playlist where Shannon talks about it, and he's the expert. He's the one you want to listen to. Here's also an article from an outside person, but you can always Google it, of why you don't want to own PFICs. So this is the real reason why, if you go into ING or if you go to Deutsche Bank or Peter Cam or any of them, why they won't take you as an American. It's because they'd end up selling you PFICs, passive foreign investment companies, and it would be very harmful on your US taxes. American Overseas is a great organization up in the Netherlands. They help Americans all around Europe. Great organization to approach if you need a tax accountant or any other professional. They will help organize somebody to talk to you so that essentially you can find the right professional for your situation instead of just the one you happen to bump into. We always say that you should only work with people that are regulated both in Europe and the United States. So we've included our two docs. Essentially, you can go to the SEC's website or broker check to make sure somebody's a company's registered in the United States. If they're not properly registered in the United States, they should be using a company that is registered in the United States like ours to be able to sell American products. In Europe, each country has its own registry, and there is passporting throughout Europe. And right now it's still passporting from the UK to Europe, although we have dual registrations in both jurisdictions. So if you're doing business in Belgium, you want to make sure that you go through the FSMA in Belgium and the SEC in the United States to make sure everybody's registered correctly in that regard. Now, I told you I was going to keep the presentation nice and short so that I'd have plenty of time for you to ask all your questions. So I've only used half the time to go through that presentation. So I'm hoping that you all have tons of questions there. Otherwise, I'll have Josh join back in and we'll just ask each other questions or try to talk amongst ourselves.
I'll just kind of take that as my cue while we wait, but I wanted to ask something on Cheryl's behalf. She's wondering about moving to Belgium. Now, what are your thoughts on what should you do before moving? Is there a way to kind of get ahead of the curve on that, or what do you think?
I love that question. That's a perfect question. So the first things that I would actually be looking at before I move to Belgium would be, first of all, to make sure that your US bank and your US brokerages will still hold your account if you move to Belgium. If not, you have basically two options. The first option is to talk to one of the many companies like ours that help American expats when they're abroad, because we're able to open an account for you. The second option is to look at certain places, maybe an address that you can use in the United States if you're only going to be there for a short period of time, to be able to keep the accounts on that American address. The surprise you don't want to get is that you tell your brokerage, if you told, say, Merrill Lynch or Goldman Sachs, hey, I'm moving to Belgium, and then they send you a letter that says, hey, sorry, you need to move your account and you have 30 days. That's a surprise that you don't want to have. So I'd ask the question well before you're moving so that you can plan on what you're doing before you get there. The second aspect is what you own inside of the portfolio. Now, the European rules are MiFID, is what it's considered. Now, MiFID is essentially a set of rules that is newer in Europe than what the PFIC rules are in the United States. Now, essentially, it says you can't own something that's managed outside of Europe, which if your portfolio is made up mostly of mutual funds, that would be managed in the United States, and therefore it would probably not meet MiFID criteria. The good news is there's no penalties for not conforming with MiFID. It's more that the advisor can get in trouble, which is why a lot of American brokerages are saying to you, please move your account if you move abroad, because they don't want to get in trouble on those types of rules. But you might want to especially take advantage of this market that's down a little bit. If you have mutual funds that are at losses or small gains, you might decide, let's clean this up before I move to Belgium, before they put in potentially a tax or a penalty on owning mutual funds. I'm not saying that they will. I'm just saying that's what I would do if I was a politician and needing to raise funds. I would basically say, let's penalize people that aren't conforming with the current rules, just like America does with the PFICs. If your bank won't accept you when you're in a foreign jurisdiction, most of our clients, they still want to have a US bank. They still might have some US transactions or US credit cards. Josh put together a great report on how to keep your credit check in America. I'm sorry, your credit record in the United States when you move abroad. And that's an important thing. So keeping some of those credit cards is going to be important, but your bank might not want you to keep your account open. So that's where the State Department Federal Credit Union will let you open an account when you're in a foreign jurisdiction, and especially Belgium. And then you have a US bank account to keep those relationships and those US assets over there. From there, you'll want to make sure you have a good long conversation with your tax accountant. We do a lot of conversations on whether somebody should be on the foreign earned income exclusion or on the credit system. And when you're in Belgium, 9 times out of 10, it probably should be the credit system. And if you don't know the difference, and if your tax accountant doesn't know the difference, you probably want to get somebody that's really knowledgeable on the cross-border issues and going through your situation before you get there, because that's going to determine how much you might want to put into your Belgian pension. If in Belgium, they have a little bit different way of doing just about everything, and pensions is definitely one of them. So on a pension, if you put the money away into your corporate pension, so think of your 401k, they have an equivalent in Belgium, they will either pay an annuitized pension when you retire, or they'll pay you out in a lump sum. The problem is the double taxation agreement between the United States and Belgium isn't the most wonderful out there. And so when you get this lump sum, the United States will be looking at taxing it. If you're on the credit system, you probably would have paid more in Belgian taxes than what you would have owned in the US. And so you can go ahead and compound up to 10 years of those credits to offset some of that tax when the lump sum distribution comes out of your Belgian pension. If you're 30 years old, that might not be as important as if you were, say, 55 or 60 and coming up on retirement. But these are all things that you want to strategize and start building well in advance of doing your tax records the year after, so that you know exactly what you're doing in that situation. And then the last one that I would add is to make sure that you have a good means to move money back and forth between the United States, between US dollars and euros. You know, doing it through the banks. I'm sorry to all the banks that we know that might be on this call, but they charge an arm and a leg for it. It's a profit center for them. So you might have a brokerage that does it at a very, very low cost. But if you don't, you should look at the likes of Sterling Bank, Wise, formerly known as TransferWise, Revolut, or one of those fintechs for those smaller amounts that you're moving back and forth. You know, if you're moving, you know, a couple $1,000s back to the US to pay student loans, pay off a credit card, you know, just to get petty cash over there for when you're traveling around there. Those are all things that essentially you want to have that ready and in force, so that when you get over to Belgium, you're not having to send it through the banking system where they'll charge you a wire fee and an exorbitant amount at the for the currency conversion on the spread.
Right. I wasn't trying to play you off there, Brian, I promise. Not this time anyway. Brilliant. That's a very comprehensive answer. So hopefully you found that useful, Cheryl. Let's see, you had another interesting question. Any financial planning advice for couples with one American and one European? What about that case?
Oh, this is a perfect type of scenario because you're able to get some advantages and you can actually make some big mistakes. Basically, the first rule is you want to have a Chinese wall in between the two of you. You don't want to have, say, a joint investment account. You don't want to have those types of issues lingering, especially having a joint investment account on the Belgian side. So basically, the American will keep their assets in America. The non-American will keep their assets, not necessarily in Belgium, but in Europe. You know, we find that Luxembourg has great platforms, Ireland as well, but essentially on a European platform. Now, the Belgian will be able to take advantage of having accumulation shares, so they will be able to avoid income tax, and also there's no capital gains. But typically there's a little bit higher fees than there are in the States, and therefore the US side, even though there'll be a little bit of tax to pay, essentially they'll benefit from those lower fees. One thing to be careful of is you don't want to, let's say if you have a joint house and you're afraid of, let's say you've owned it for a long period of time, you don't want to move that entire house over from one to the other because there's a gifting allowance to a non-US spouse. And that gifting limit is around $155,000 per year. So be careful if you're moving more than $155,000 in a year, you're gonna have to use your gift exclusion from your estate taxes to do so. So if you're doing it to get rid of your US citizenship, fine, just make that declaration because you won't need your estate tax exemption. But if you forget to do it, it can be a very, very costly error. Again, that's 155,000 US dollars per year that you're able to gift to a non-US spouse. But then when it really comes down to it, what you want to strategize on is which taxes are better on each side, and therefore it might be different balances of assets to different people. In other words, we might try to increase the amount on the US side in the investments account, and then increase the real estate side for the non-Americans account, so that we don't expose ourselves to potential US capital gains tax on a house sale or the likes, which get impacted just as much based on currencies as they could on real estate appreciation.
Awesome. Another question from Paul this time. How familiar are you with NATO employees, and does the advice still apply given the tax-exempt status and special residency? It's an interesting one.
That's a great question. And it's not just NATO. NATO has a new prevalence nowadays. the last 100 days, but it applies to any dignitaries, European Commission, European Parliament, anybody that is basically tax exempt from that status. So essentially, when it comes to these individuals, there's two sets. There's those that are more on the military line, that essentially they're considered US residents living overseas, and then there's the dignitary status. Now, essentially, either way, there might have complications when it comes to certain aspects like their brokerage account and the such, which same thing as what I was saying for everybody else. Either use a US address or use a firm like mine that essentially will help be able to set up those accounts abroad. But you still want to meet those different parameters. You don't want to buy those Belgian securities. You want to make sure to keep those investments in the States, but you won't be subject to the tax in the same way. So the planning's a little bit different. The good news is that the NATO pensions and the likes are much easier to deal with than most of the other Belgian pensions. So it's all the same rules, just probably a little bit easier, especially on the tax side.
All right, great. Follow up from Cheryl, since we talked a bit about how to get ready for life in Belgium in advance. How far in advance would you recommend, or would that be something that you should look to start implementing as soon as possible?
Absolutely. I think it's just like training for a marathon. The earlier you start, essentially, the better position you're going to be in. We run these types of webinars on a quarterly basis, and we always have different guest speakers from different places to take part in them, so that you're always able to kind of build on your knowledge. To me, get in contact with us no matter how soon you're going, because the longer we're having the conversation, the more prepared and more comfortable you are going to be with making those changes when you need to. It doesn't mean you have to make the changes day one. It just means that you'll have more to think about all the questions that you have on your mind. So the earlier, the better. What was it? I had a fortune cookie way back when. I had a great piece of advice. The best day to plant a tree, 20 years ago. Second best day, today. Right? It's never, let's plant a tree in a year or 2 years. So.
Right. Okay, it's making me a bit hungry with that. Thanks, Brian.
I hope your lunches are not made up of fortune cookies, Josh. I hope we pay you a good living wage.
Hey, don't judge me. Okay, it's my own business. Almaz has a question. He's looking for a way to buy ETFs as a U.S. citizen. Is there a minimum amount he needs to invest? And would a RoboAdvisor be available to U.S. citizens in Belgium? Also wants to know about the expense ratio.
Oh, it almost feels like we planted that one. I promise we didn't. So we have, as of this year, we've launched a RoboAdvisor of our own. It's dfdirect.com. Maybe Josh will drop that URL into the chat. Mm-hmm. Now, right now, DF Direct is only available if you have a US address to be able to set it up directly on the website. But no need to worry if you don't have that US address. Josh and his team around him will be able to help you manually set up a account on the RoboAdvisor with the Belgian address. We have zero minimum, and it costs 0.5% per annum to run the portfolio. That includes all of the trading fees and the platform fees, so 0.5%. And it buys into our different portfolios, which are the exact same portfolios that we use for our advisory practice. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that nobody is left with the excuse of, well, I have no place to save. I have no place to be able to get started. We're hoping in the next couple of months that we're going to have that live to where you'll be able to do it directly through the website, but you don't have to worry about that because it's Josh and his team that are going to be able to help onboard you. So it's them that have to do the extra admin until we get that little technology in there. And Josh is going to drop you his email address, which he just did.
Already done.
You're brilliant. we're on the same page here. And if you just drop him an email, he'll be able to direct you through that process.
Yep, definitely reach out. And yeah, we can definitely have a conversation about that. Happy to do it. Question from the Q&A session, or sorry, the section. Jim, when you're living abroad using a U.S. address for a brokerage account, do 1099s flag it as belonging to a certain state? And then how do you legally avoid treating the income as that state? So how do you manage that situation?
That is a brilliant, brilliant question, Jim. Thank you. I feel like we placed these questions, but I promise you we did. So there's certain states that are notorious for basically making your life very hard if you use that as an address. Those states have notoriously been New York and California. So essentially, if that's the only address that you're using, I would go the extra mile and try to find a company like ours that can go ahead and house your account using your Belgian address. There's 7 states that don't have a state income tax. For any of the Democrats on this call, I'm sorry, you're not going to like the list of states on there. But essentially, what do we have? We have Florida, Nevada, Texas, Washington, Wyoming.
I think Alaska's on there.
I think Alaska's on there, yeah. And I can't remember the 7.
And then a wild card. I don't know. Joker.
Absolutely. But essentially, a very easy Google search of which 7 those are. And essentially, that's the safest way. South Dakota, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Nice save.
So essentially, using those 7 states is going to be the best, because naturally they're not going to care to flag you for any of that tax if they don't have a state income tax. Now, I've never heard of anybody getting hit with the other 41 states that have a state income tax, but the word of warning that I would use is pretty much every government is short on cash, and this is an easy way to flag people right now. So try to use one of those Florida, Texas, South Dakota, etc. addresses if you can, or use your Belgian address directly.
Great. Cheryl, another question. So it looks to her as if she should avoid investing in U.S. mutual funds in favor of individual stocks if you anticipate a move to Europe. I'm guessing this is going to be a discussion about mutual funds versus ETFs, and just kind of the strategy there as opposed to individual stocks for the sake of diversification, right?
Wonderful question, but I'm going to insert one extra element in there. Exchange traded funds are typically not managed. So for instance, if we buy the S&P 500 on the US stock exchange, we avoid the PFIC problems, but because it's not a managed fund, it meets the interpretation of MiFID. Now, the interpretation of MiFID is basically one paragraph, or my interpretation is based on this one paragraph that says that it needs to be actively managed outside of Europe to basically not conform with MiFID. So that's where we're able to easily say the S&P 500 on the US stock exchange is completely fine, whereas a mutual fund wouldn't be. Now, I would not, if you have a ton of capital gains, I would not suggest selling all of your mutual funds all at once. But mutual funds in the United States have to pay their dividends out completely and their capital gains out. Now, most individuals, what they do is they go ahead and they reinvest that because there's no cost in doing so. So the first thing that we suggest is we're paying those capital gains and the dividends each year on those mutual funds and getting them reinvested. Let's turn off that reinvestment vehicle so it comes out as cash, and that we rebalance that over the course of time into exchange traded funds, or if the portfolio merits it, individual stocks. And that means if Europe were to go after that and tax it, which, like I said, they're not at this point, and I'm not trying to fearmonger you, I just find I want to be as conservative as possible so that we're always prepared for plan B. That way, in years like this year where the market's down, you might take some of those losses to offset some of those gains. And this is called tax harvesting, to go ahead and continue minimizing the number of mutual funds in there. I, for the most part, find that if we build the right portfolio with ETFs, we'll reduce our costs from what a mutual fund portfolio is. So even if you were back in the United States, I would still suggest this type of strategy, but you might just say that that's because I'm cheap. There's not that many strategies that I would prefer to have in an active strategy. Emerging markets and fixed income are the exceptions, but when it comes to large cap equities, I'd prefer to be in a passive or thematic approach.
All right, great. Jordan would like to know, can you share the best resources for taxes or tax advice for expats in Belgium?
That's a beautiful question. So essentially, Josh will hopefully drop a couple more links in here. There's the Expat Directory, which is a great resource that has a listing of different tax advisors. There's naturally 2 members of the American Club of Brussels, 2 corporate members, Carl Meir, which is meirtaxes.com, and Shannon Mayer, who just changed his firm name, and I apologize. Moorhead is the name of the firm. Essentially, they're both American Club members. They've both lived in Belgium for long periods of time, so they understand both sides in certain regards. Then the ACA Tax Directory. So earlier I was talking about American citizens abroad. If you go to the bottom of their front page, there's an ACA Tax Directory, and it has listings of all the different tax advisors. There are plenty of great US tax experts. And if we know kind of your situation, we can direct you to exactly who the best one would be, because naturally I would categorize most of these tax advisors into 3 fields. And I'm not going to name names on a publicly recorded webinar, but essentially you typically have your one-man shops that are very helpful for those simple tax situations where the questions are whether we should be on the credit system, the FEIE, or simple approaches like that. They keep the prices down, and there's even an online version that Natalie runs from Austria that works perfectly, and it's not going to do the damage that TurboTax does, which to me has 2 faults. One of them, they do a great job with expat taxes, but then they require you to have a US credit card with a US address, which is kind of silly. And second of all, well, they also lobby to make our taxes harder. So therefore, I'm not ever going to be very supportive of TurboTax because they're one of the reasons why we have so many problems. Sorry, I've gone on a couple political rants today. But you have that bracket that are kind of the I've got a simple situation, I just need somebody to get me over the hump, or I just need the technology to get me over the hump. The second grouping are kind of your regional advisors. This is, I have a property in France, I live in Belgium, and I'm a US citizen. So you might need one of those regional advisors. And then you have the big 4, and naturally the pricing goes along that route. So if you give us a quick call, I can guide you in less than 5 minutes on who the best person would be to talk to in your situation.
All right, and then another question from Jordan. Tried to invest last year and set up an account. Since he's abroad, his investment is just sitting in the account. He mentions about something he can do, I suppose, with those funds available. Could we expand on that?
So he tried to set up the account. I take it with a broker back in the States.
Yeah, I suppose it's not really clear from the question.
Sorry, Jordan. Not quite.
Okay, yeah.
Quite understanding the question. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess they just didn't invest it because he was abroad, I guess was the point.
So Jordan, like I was saying earlier, you know, if you give us a call, we can definitely take care of it and help you get started. Like I said, we have our no minimum low cost solution in DF Direct, or we have our full financial planning solutions with Dunhill Financial. Otherwise, you can actually just use an American address and they'll probably go ahead and take that. But we can definitely get you all set up and ready.
All right, brilliant. Well, it seems like maybe we've exhausted all the questions. So I guess, yeah, well done well done, Brian. And I guess if there's nothing else, then I guess there's nothing left to do but to thank you, Brian, for being here, giving us all that great knowledge, and thanks everybody for attending. So we'll be reaching out after the event to just kind of recap what we went over. And aside from that, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to the team. I sent you the email addresses there, so it's always definitely worth our time to have a conversation with you. Aside from that, just hope everybody has a brilliant rest of your day. And yeah, just take care, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. All the best. Cheers.